Imagine this. You're surrounded by people, colleagues who smile at you, friends who tag you in photos, family members who call from time to time. There's laughter in the room, background noise from a television, and the constant hum of notifications lighting up your phone. And yet, there's a silence inside you that none of it touches. Not the kind of silence you get when you're alone in nature or reading a good book. This is something colder, something heavier. A silence that lingers even in the middle of conversation. A silence that doesn't come from the absence of others, but from the absence of being seen. And that's the paradox. How can you feel utterly alone when you're never actually by yourself? We've been taught that loneliness means isolation, emptiness, a lack of connection. That it strikes when you have no one to talk to, no one to hold, no one to come home to. But the truth is far more disturbing. Loneliness doesn't begin when people leave. It begins when you do. When you start censoring what you feel just to be accepted. When you betray your instincts to play a part in someone else's script. When you look in the mirror and see not a person, but a performance. A mask you've worn so long, even you forget who's underneath it. This isn't just emotional discomfort, it's existential exile. You are with people, but not among them. You're heard, but not understood. You're seen, but not known. And so you scroll, you smile, you show up. But inside, something grows, quietly, invisibly, like a houseplant in a windowless room, twisting, shrinking, dying. What if loneliness isn't the absence of people, but the absence of authenticity? What if the most severe kind of loneliness isn't caused by solitude, but by the fragmentation of the self? Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." What happens when everything important becomes unspeakable? When your inner world becomes a locked room and you've forgotten where you placed the key? What if loneliness is not a symptom, but a message, not a weakness, but a signal? What if it's not trying to hurt you, but trying to wake you up? You've been chasing connection, but maybe you've been chasing it in all the wrong places. Maybe the thing you've been missing isn't another person. Maybe it's you. And if that's true, then the real question isn't, how do I stop feeling lonely? It's something far more unsettling. Who have I become to feel this way? Let's go deeper. You weren't born this way. You didn't enter the world feeling alienated from it. As a child, you didn't question whether your laughter was too loud, your tears too much, or your dreams too strange. You spoke before thinking. You danced without shame. You reached for what you wanted with open hands and a fearless heart. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that freedom was traded for acceptance. You learned to filter yourself. You learned that certain emotions made people uncomfortable. That vulnerability invited judgment. That being too different meant being left out. And so you adapted. But adaptation is a double-edged sword. You built a version of yourself that could survive society, a polished self, a strategic self, a self that smiled in the right moments, nodded at the right beliefs, fit neatly into the containers others handed you. And somewhere in that exchange, you buried the real one. Jung called this buried self the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it is unseen. It's everything you've disowned in order to belong. Your unspoken desires, your raw emotions, your hunger for meaning, for depth, for truth. And loneliness, real loneliness, is the quiet grief of being cut off from that self. Nietzsche warned us about this, about the cost of conformity. He saw how modern morality forces people into pre-approved roles until they become strangers to themselves. He wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. But what happens when the tribe isn't just your culture, but the voice in your own head? You tell yourself to stay calm when you want to scream, to be rational when your heart is breaking, to move on when your soul is still anchored to what was lost. And the world applauds you for it, for being mature, responsible, well-adjusted. but well-adjusted to what? To a culture where depth is inconvenient, where silence is filled with noise, where image matters more than intimacy. Arthur Schopenhauer believed loneliness was the inevitable fate of deep thinkers in a shallow world. That those who seek truth will often walk alone, not because they are unloved, but because they see too clearly. And what they see often contradicts the comforting illusions others cling to. But maybe the real problem isn't that you're alone. Maybe it's that the world around you rewards your absence from yourself. It praises the mask and ignores the soul behind it. And so the root of your loneliness isn't a lack of relationships. It's a disconnection from what's real, from your essence, your instincts, your inner voice. You've been taught to fear solitude, but maybe the true danger is something far more subtle. Self-abandonment in the name of fitting in. And the price? Let's explore that next. You don't notice it at first. That's the sinister beauty of it. The slow erosion of self doesn't feel like a collapse. It feels like being productive, like being admired, like finally being enough. You laugh when expected. You meet deadlines. You maintain conversations with people who wouldn't notice if your soul left the room. And slowly, you begin to mistake functionality for fulfillment. But underneath that performance, a fracture deepens. Neurologically, loneliness activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and insula light up as if you've been cut, wounded. The body doesn't care that you're in a crowd. It knows the truth. It knows that being unseen is a kind of death. And so the symptoms begin to appear, not as dramatic breakdowns, but as slow, quiet rot. Fatigue that no amount of sleep fixes. Overthinking that hijacks your peace, a gnawing restlessness that chokes even the quiet moments. You reach for dopamine, scrolling, binging, consuming, anything to outrun that ghost in your chest. And the world tells you this is normal. They give it a dozen names: burnout, disconnection, stress, anxiety, but rarely call it what it is: a soul suffocating from lack of authenticity. From the unbearable weight of unexpressed truth, you were meant to feel, to connect from the core, not from convenience. But you've been conditioned to keep things surface level, to fear being too much, to treat your inner life like a liability. And here's the paradox. The more you numb your loneliness, the more it controls you. You become hyper-attuned to rejection, interpreting silence as judgment. You become performative in relationships, always calculating, adapting, shrinking. You seek validation, but it never lands. Compliments feel hollow. Praise passes through you like vapor. Why? Because it's not you being loved. It's the mask. And so you spiral. Deeper into curated connections, deeper into empty conversations, deeper into yourself, but never into your truth, never into real intimacy. Because real intimacy requires exposure, requires surrender, requires being known. And how can anyone know you if you've forgotten who you are? Cognitive dissonance creeps in, a subtle sense that something is off, but you can't name it. That vague dissatisfaction that no achievement seems to fix, that hunger for something, anything real. But it isn't your fault. You live in a world addicted to appearance, where vulnerability is weakness, where silence is awkward, where loneliness is treated with distractions, not depth. And yet, a question remains. If this is the cage, where's the key? Where do you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you were forced to bury? You're closer than you think, but it will require a rebellion, and not against others, against the version of you that was built to survive. You've lived as a ghost of yourself for long enough. To break free from loneliness, you won't need more followers, more plans, or even more people in your life. You'll need something far more dangerous: truth. And truth begins with a confrontation. You must stand face to face with the version of yourself you've constructed for approval, the one who always knows the right thing to say, the one who avoids conflict to keep the peace, the one who trades silence for safety. That version helped you survive. But survival is not the same as living. The rebellion begins the moment you stop asking, "What do they want me to be?" and start asking, "What am I hiding from myself?" Carl Jung taught that the path to wholeness leads not through light, but through the shadow. The parts of you that were rejected, shamed, or exiled. The parts you locked away to be accepted. To integrate your shadow is not to become darker, it is to become real. You don't need to heal every wound before speaking your truth. You need only the courage to speak while still trembling, to allow the broken parts of you into the light, to stop editing your soul for mass consumption. And yes, it will feel like dying at first, because in a way, it is. The death of the mask, the death of the obedient self, the death of the illusion that hiding your pain makes you strong. But in that death, something ancient is born. Authenticity, not the superficial kind, tattoos and slogans and curated vulnerability. Real authenticity, the kind that says, "This is me, unfiltered, flawed, alive." And you'll be shocked by what happens next. The moment you begin to live from that place, you will feel less lonely, even in solitude. Because loneliness was never about being alone. It was about being divorced from your truth. And when you speak from your truth, something remarkable occurs. You begin to attract others who recognize it. People who don't need your performance, who are drawn not to your image, but to your essence. You begin to replace the shallow with the sacred. It's not a fast path. It's not an easy one, but it's the only one that leads you back to yourself. Look at those who walked before you, Nietzsche, Jung, Huxley, Frankl. They lived in conflict with their time, but in alignment with their truth. They knew that rebellion was not rage against the world, but liberation from the false self. You don't need to scream. You don't need to convince anyone. You only need to come home to what you abandoned long ago. And when you do, you'll realize the most profound truth of all. Let's go there. It was never about being alone. It was about being unseen while standing in plain sight. About smiling while quietly unraveling inside. About living in a world where we've mastered the art of appearing connected while forgetting what connection actually means. But here is the final truth, the one most people never dare to face. Loneliness is not a punishment. It's a compass. It points not outward, but inward. It doesn't ask for company. It asks for integration. It doesn't beg to be numbed. It demands to be heard. The ache you feel is not proof that you are broken. It's proof that somewhere inside you, something is still alive, still reaching, still trying to be known, not by others, but by you. This is the part most miss. The cure for loneliness is not always to be loved. Sometimes it's to remember yourself. You thought you needed someone else to complete you. But what if loneliness is what you feel when you've forgotten your own wholeness? The parts of you you've buried, the instincts you've silenced, the truths you've bitten back for the sake of harmony. They didn't disappear. They're still there, watching you live a life they can't breathe in. And they're not angry. They're just waiting for the day you'll say, "No more pretending. I want to know who I really am." That's what loneliness truly is. It's not the absence of others. It's the soul whispering, "Come back." When you finally answer that call, when you walk into the silence instead of away from it, you find something extraordinary. Solitude. Solitude is not emptiness, it's presence. It's being with yourself so fully, so honestly, that the void collapses under the weight of truth. And from that space, real connection becomes possible. Not the kind built on validation, ego, or roles, but the kind born from two people who no longer need each other to feel whole, and so can finally see one another without distortion. This is the end of loneliness, not when you are surrounded by people, but when you are no longer a stranger to yourself. Let the world think you're antisocial. Let them call it isolation. They don't know the sacredness of solitude. They don't know that you are not lost. You are becoming whole. So the next time you feel that ache, that quiet pull of loneliness, Don't run. Sit with it. Listen to it. Let it strip away the noise, the masks, the roles, and then ask yourself, what part of me is trying to come back to life? The moment you ask that, you're no longer alone. You're finally home.